Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on from where you join us. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on global perspectives on conflict transformation. My name is Beatrix Austin. I head the conflict transformation research team here at the Berlin-based Berghof Foundation. And over the span of my career at Berghof, I've spent nearly 15 years now editing one of our flagship publications, the Berghof Handbook for Conflict Transformation. So it's been my privilege to think about what it means to transform conflicts globally, locally, for many, many years now. What has changed in the past few years is that we are really asked to relearn what it means to attempt conflict transformation, to build peace. And the impulses for relearning come from several directions. They come from a change in the global world that surrounds us. The many people who have helped us put together this event have thought through many perspectives that feed into it. And one of the prevalent strategic realizations that we have is that we operate in a much more multipolar world than the one that we have at least been used to see for many decades. This multipolarity in practice is one of the impulses that leads us to ask what different ways of thinking through conflict transformation and peace building are there across the world. A second one is an intellectual curiosity to really expand our own horizons, to look amidst a world that is questioning certainties, that is looking at where do our sources of knowledge and ideas actually come from, what others are out there, in a setting that places a lot of emphasis on opening conversations, on providing a space for a different kind of dialogue and exchange. In that sense, creating a more diverse knowledge on conflict transformation is what we're also after with this series. So both from an imperative of practice that works in a multipolar world, and also from an imperative of constantly being open to relearn what we mean when we talk about conflict transformation, relearn it together with all the different and diverse partners that we need to make this happen. We are embarking on this series. Today marks the first one in what we hope to be 3 or 4 events this year and potentially more in the years to come. And what country and what ideas we're focusing in first is something that my colleague Karin Göldner-Ebenthal will share with you next. So enjoy, and over to South Africa.
Thank you, Beatrix, and welcome indeed also from my side to this first session of our series. And today we will hear the perspectives from South Africa, and I'm very excited about this panel to start. Before though, I want to give you a quick run of the session and how you can get involved. I will hand over to our moderator, Professor Tim Mariti from the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, who will guide us through the main part of the session, the panel. And the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation is also the co-organizer of this event. And we are very, very happy, Tim, to have you today. And we will not only hear from him, but we will hear introductory statements for all of our speakers, followed by a discussion. As a wrap-up to this session, we will hear my colleague Véronique Dulué reflect on key insights. And as we go on, we will post short bios of all speakers in the chat to save some time. Please have a look there. And at last, of course, we want your engagement. So please, you are very much invited to comment and ask questions in the chat throughout the session. We are very much looking forward to a lively debate in the chat, and our moderator will pick up all the questions, or most of them, as time allows. So back to South Africa and why we as the Berghof Foundation chose it, and also to start us off in this quest for a more global perspective on conflict transformation. Our rationale was simple, and I will make 3 quick points. First, of course, South Africa's own history of conflict transformation. I won't go into it. I'll just say that it serves globally as an example for those seeking to be inspired on how to achieve peace. And two aspects are worthy to mention, particularly here. It's the role of justice and the way they managed to create a positive reimagination of the state that helped to build bridges and ties that were enduring, which is the second point, because peace is never an end in itself that once achieved will remain indefinitely. There will always be challenges to peace, and there need to be found new ways to deal with grievances in society, a lesson that we're also rediscovering here in Europe. And South Africa, the lesson they have learned and are still learning are very much worth listening to and have relevant insights for all contexts. And third, speaking about global perspectives and a reshaping of the global order, it's worth to highlight South Africa's standing in the world. It is one of the BRIC countries and has established itself as an actor that is able and willing to engage, to contribute, to bring ideas, and to push back where it sees necessary. It isn't only internally active for peace, but also externally, regionally, and beyond. Thus, South Africa for us has the justified self-assurance based on the 2 points I made before as well, that its state and non-state actors have something to contribute to the discussion on global conflict transformation, and we are well set to listen to them, which is when I'm handing over to Tim. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen, and hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar and our discussion today on conflict transformation in a multipolar world, perspectives from South Africa, brought to you by the Berghof Foundation and the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation based in Cape Town, South Africa. My name is Tim Murithi, and I'm the head of the Peacebuilding Interventions program at the IJR, and the IJR has been working over the last 21 years to support governments, societies, to transform conflict, to promote peace, justice, and reconciliation through research, policy, engagement, and training, and also community dialogues. So, and I would like to just start by thanking the Berghof team for proposing this collaboration, Bea, Karen, Caroline, Johanna, Veronique, and the rest of the team who has been working behind the scenes to put this together. I would also like to thank our eminent panel, Priyal Singh, Mohammed Baba, and Professor Cheryl Hendricks, and Veronique Duode, who will speak towards the end, who I will introduce briefly for taking the time to join us as panelists and to share their thoughts with us on this very challenging topic. And since lockdown, it appears that we are almost always on virtual platforms, virtually all the time. And so I would like to thank those of you who have managed to take time from your busy schedules to join us for our discussion here today. As I stated earlier, we will engage with South African perspectives on conflict transformation, but through a double lens. One on the state of conflict transformation in South Africa, but we will also cast our sights on South Africa's conflict transformation role in the Southern Africa region, as well as across the African continent. South Africa's transition in 1994 from a brutal white supremacist apartheid regime is still hailed by many as a remarkable achievement, which was led by Nelson Mandela, amongst other civic leaders, as well as across the country, social and political movements such as the United Democratic Movement. And South Africa's choice of a conflict transformation, peace building, and national reconciliation approach to addressing the long-standing oppression fueled by British and Dutch colonialism and internal repression, which generated inhumanity, injustice, and human rights violations of the then National Party-inspired apartheid regime, was met with approval by many sectors of the African society and the international community at large. The restorative justice approach embodied in the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, was designed to unearth and surface the underlying sources of tension and division so as to map out concrete actions for redress in order to chart a pathway for reconciling or restoring human dignity, delivering justice for those who suffered from the depraved acts of this inhumane system and promote conflict transformation in South Africa. However, after the initial brief honeymoon period in the South African transition, the conflict transformation and reconciliation project became derailed as the governing party, the African National Congress, diverted from its initial vision and agenda, and corruption, misrule, and unethical leadership unfortunately began to infuse national, provincial, and municipal systems of government, which meant citizens and communities who had been waiting for an improvement in their livelihoods in terms of housing, healthcare, education, access to employment and infrastructure so that they could contribute towards building the economy and healing the society, were left to a certain extent in limbo. We know following the ongoing Zondo Commission of Inquiry into state capture and tenderpreneurship that infiltrated state institutions, that massive amounts of financial resources were fleeced, particularly under the Jacob Zuma administration between 2009 and 2018, and diverted to private beneficiaries such as the Gupta brothers and the private companies such as Bosasa and headed by notorious actors such as Gavin Watson and Mr. Greasy. State capture has also led to factionalism within the ANC, which is currently playing out today, even as we speak, in the form of a battle for the soul of the ANC. This raises questions as to whether internally South Africa is still, in fact, pursuing a conflict transformation and peace building agenda, or whether this project has in fact been thoroughly derailed by the infighting within the governing party. Is South Africa running on autopilot, for example? And if it is, does this mean that citizens to a large extent are now doomed to seeking self-help solutions to their socio-economic and political challenges? And then the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified and amplified the existing fault lines in society. We continue to see a parallel epidemic of gender-based violence, xenophobia, and racism. And now this racism also manifests intergenerationally as children born after the 94 transition begin to exhibit similar mental attitudes to their forebears. Similar to the resurgence of right-wing fascism we see in Europe and in America. So the inevitable question does arise as to, is the South African conflict transformation project still on course? Can we arrest this trend away from focusing on psychosocial peace building, trauma-informed processes to bring about genuine mindset shifts in the country? What are the prospects of revisiting South Africa's domestic social cohesion agenda? Is it possible to revitalize the peace building processes within the country? And what can South African people do in this situation? These are some of the questions that our panel will consider during our discussion. And the second lens I mentioned we'll be utilizing today is South Africa's role in the Southern Africa region, as well as across the rest of Africa. As I mentioned earlier, the South African transition is still hailed by many as a model for other countries. Its regional and continental role in promoting conflict transformation in other African countries also began almost simultaneously as South Africa achieved its independence from the apartheid system. South Africa has intervened politically through peacemaking and peacekeeping interventions in Lesotho, within the region of Southern Africa, Lesotho, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, across the African continent in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Somalia, and in the north, Libya, to the west, Cote d'Ivoire, to name a few. What has been South Africa's record in promoting conflict transformation in the region, as well as the rest of the continent? And given South Africa's multiple challenges at home and the need to focus its resources on national conflict transformation, should it be playing such a regional continental role? And our distinguished panel today will assist us in engaging with these challenging questions. I would like now to introduce the panel to you in the order that they will be speaking. Our first speaker will be Priyal Singh, who is a researcher with the Institute for Security Studies based in Pretoria. He will speak to South Africa's conflict transformation role in the region as an actor in peace operations and multilateral settings. He will be followed by Mohamed Barba, who is director with the In Transform initiative, also based in Pretoria, and he will speak to South Africa's role in other parts of Africa with reference to some of the work that ITI's approach is undertaking in support of South Africa's interventions, which highlights the role of civil society in supporting conflict transformation interventions across the continent. Our third speaker will be Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who is Executive Director of the Africa Institute at the Humanities Social Science Research Council based in Pretoria, who will speak on the shifts and continuities in SA's approach to conflict transformation and peace building in Africa. And following the open discussion amongst the panelists, we will generate some input from participants. Prior to closing our sessions, we will have a reflection of our discussion from Dr. Veronique Duode, who is a senior advisor with the Berghof Foundation based in Berlin. So in terms of the way we're going to proceed, our speakers will make brief 5-minute opening remarks, and then we shall have a discussion amongst the panel members in case the issues that they raise that others would like to engage with. And then we will then begin engaging with the comments and questions from all of you participants who've joined us today, who are participating in this meeting. But in the interim, I would like to invite you to begin writing in your comments and questions in the chat function of this webinar, and we shall bring on board those views as we proceed and have an interactive and dynamic discussion. Also, feel free to tweet, for those of you who are Twitterati and in the Twitter sphere, tweet at Berghof FND, Berghof FND, and at _IGR_ and hashtag peacebuilding. On that note, I would like to thank again all our panelists for taking the time to join us today. And I will now hand over the floor to our first speaker, Priyal, who will kick us off in our discussion. Priyal, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Prof. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Firstly, I'd like to thank the Berghof Foundation and the IJR for putting together this very timely discussion in which South African perspectives on peace building will hopefully contribute to a broader global understanding of best practice. In my presentation, I will provide a brief general overview of the broad trends that have characterized South Africa's bilateral and multilateral approaches to peace building, and how the last decade stands in particularly stark contrast to the country's earlier efforts to play a decisive peace building leadership role across the continent. So to begin, I think South Africa's peace building and conflict transformation initiatives really took roots in the 1990s and early 2000s. Which, as the Prof has mentioned, this followed its relatively peaceful democratic transition, and it sought to utilize and leverage its domestic experiences in order to facilitate sustainable peace across the region. South Africa's peace building, and I think these efforts aligned well to the country's early aspirational foreign policy. And this was a period characterized by the notion of South Africa punching well above its weight within global peace and security institutions. And this was ultimately anchored by foreign policy motivations in which the country sought to undo the legacy of regional destabilization by the apartheid-era governments. And as time progressed, South Africa was increasingly seen as this key actor with sub-regional and continental leadership aspirations. And again, by leveraging the experiences of its own peace building and conflict transformation history, this provided it a very deep kind of reservoir of political capital and goodwill on the world stage. And this allowed South Africa to pursue its own bilateral peace building interventions in many other countries across the continent. From playing a peace building role in the establishment, from playing a leading role in the establishment of the African Union and its associated peace and security structures, to its early conflict resolution initiatives in Burundi and the DRC, South Africa rose to this kind of prominence as a willing and engaged peace and security actor in countries across the continent which really didn't pose any direct or conventional threat to South Africa's own peace, security, or stability. Rather, its efforts were rationalized by a foreign policy that was centered on the idea that our long-term development was intricately interwoven with that of the continent, and that it accordingly had a responsibility to play this kind of regional leadership role. And these developments, interesting, coincided with the broader development of global peacebuilding policy and practice, with the notable establishments of the UN's peacebuilding architecture in the mid-2000s, as well as the African Union's post-conflict reconstruction and development policy framework during the same period. South Africa's own thinking on its roles and responsibilities as a peace builder was therefore informed by this kind of growing global discourse surrounding resilience and state fragility, stabilization, and mitigating relapses back into conflicts. The establishment of the African Renaissance Fund in 2000 was further indicative of this kind of growing political will and awareness that the country's efforts across the continent was a vital component of its foreign policy, necessary to maintain its international standing as a committed and capable international peace and security stakeholder. Despite this, however, the country has always lacked a clear official policy framework that directly speaks to either the UN's concept of peace building or the AU's largely analogous concept of post-conflict reconstruction and development. What we've seen is actually South Africa has always tended to prioritize its role within multilateral peacekeeping and peace support operations, and accordingly how peace building and conflict transformation tasks could be incorporated into the mandates of such missions and implemented within mission settings. The development of the country's role conception within these missions can be traced as far back as the 96 White Paper on National Defense, through all the various, the two different defense reviews, and also the seminal 1999 White Paper on South Africa's participation in international peace missions. And I think for the audience today, all of these are publicly available if you would like to access these. So this kind of peacekeeping focused thinking informed the country's efforts in Burundi, in which South Africa played a leading facilitation role in the Arusha peace process. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much of the details around this, but South Africa also played a similar role in the DRC in the early and mid 2000s, and its support to stability in that country continues up until the present day through the Force Intervention Brigade. South Africa's broader multilateral institutional engagements in support of conflict transformation have also taken shape during its 3 terms as a non-elected member of the UN Security Council in 2007, 2011, and most recently in 2019 to 2020. And throughout all of these appointments, the country prioritized the strengthening of the interinstitutional partnership between the United Nations and the African Union, and its early efforts in particular have led to the much more institutionalized partnership that we currently see today between the UN and the AU. The country has also served on the UN Peacebuilding Commission and is currently a member of the body, but its tangible achievements here are much more difficult to decipher. More broadly speaking, however, we can also generally understand the country's peacebuilding efforts under the umbrella of its official high-level mediation interventions, technical and capacity building efforts, and the provision of humanitarian assistance in fragile and conflict-affected states. Again, I won't go into too much detail, I'm aware of the time, but I think all of these featured elements of direct intervention to facilitate political agreements in support of long-term peace building and development, supporting the development of resilient state and public institutions, and attempting to address root causes through facilitated dialogue. I think those have been the key peace building and conflict transformation elements. And then moving on to the final bits of my presentation, I just want to mention that in spite of all of these efforts, and aligning to what the Prof said in terms of the last couple of years with state capture and the rest of it, we have seen a very noticeable trend in which the country's peacebuilding engagements have not been adequately coordinated or prioritized, in spite of the tremendous utility of its past peacebuilding engagements in bolstering its international standing and influence. South Africa has largely failed to prioritize a strategic and directed foreign policy that links its bilateral and multilateral peacebuilding engagements within a broader foreign policy framework. And we've seen this most clearly in the prolonged struggle to transition the African Renaissance Fund into this proposed South African Development Partnership Agency. We've also seen these broader trends being acknowledged by the government itself in a 2019 foreign policy review process in which the then Minister of International Relations recognized the country's failure to play its expected role on the world stage. All of this, of course, is a symptom of the general political and economic malaise that has afflicted South Africa for well over a decade now. But we have seen some promising signs of a turnaround. I'd like to close my presentation by just adding that the credibility and political capital gained by South Africa on the world stage as a result of its democratic transition is something that we cannot squander. It's precisely on account of this transition that the country was able to establish its early role as a committed and capable peace-building actor. And what is needed now more than ever is for us to prioritize tangible peace-building initiatives that are strategically aligned to a revitalized broader foreign policy. We need to go beyond paying lip service to global peace-building debates and processes. And this can only be done by prioritizing on-the-ground interventions that tangibly impact vulnerable populations in conflict and conflict-affected states. Prof, I'd like to close there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Priyal, for that very insightful presentation. And it has, I think the initial opening remarks have spurred one question already in the chat function. Eleanor Mura from Arigato International asks, states that conflict transformation is still ongoing in South Africa, but there is still a case for revitalizing it even further. Education should play a stronger role by bringing in ethical reflections into the classroom and pursuing what we call at the IGR brave conversations. So here, Eleanor is emphasizing the role of peace education. So we move straight to Mohammed to provide us with his thoughts. Mohammed, you have the floor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, am I unmuted now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Proceed.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. I agree by and large with what Priyal had to say. And much of my input would be emanating from our own experiences and going down at ground level in the countries that we have been involved in. And, you know, when I read the concept notes for this seminar, it made me think about some of the assumptions we made about the conditions in the countries in which we work, and made assumptions that those conditions, the conditions that assisted the South African process, exist in the countries that we are working in. Those were in the early years, but we've made certain observations, and our experience has made us change course along the way organically. To succinctly describe the challenge in our negotiations in South Africa and what we take over from here and the lessons from here to the countries in which we operate, we were fighting a system, the apartheid system, which fragmented the country and tried to fragment the country geographically and tried to enhance the ethnic impulses and bring about the Bantu system by elevating the ethnic impulses. This largely informed our approach. What is it that has to happen to create a state, the notion of a state? How, in many of the countries we operate, we find that these ethnic impulses emerge, whether it is based on interests emanating from the ethnicity or access to resources. And we spend quite a bit of time in trying to create a kind of patriotism to a common state. We've learned this from our experiences in Libya, in Iraq, where once one person, one vote came in, what actually translated was these ethnic impulses were elevated. So when the South African experience, and I think it's one of the success stories of the South African negotiations, is whatever the differences were, the emergence of one South Africa, regardless of the differences and all the devious methods that the apartheid system used, that remains intact. But the other elements that came in was whatever negotiations we did it within the rule of law. It would be disingenuous to think that the politicians achieved this. It was in the context of a very, very strong civil society activity. The fact that we were in a country, despite all its weaknesses, the apartheid system had strong institutions. They were used for nefarious purposes, but the institutions existed. And more so, there was a very strong industrial and commercial class. This is important because it brought the diplomatic community in. The overseas investors had an interest in what was happening in South Africa because they needed to have a settlement. All these factors brought in the kind of pressures and incentives for the various interests to participate. What our challenge was to create the necessary incentives with a participatory process, which was inclusive, so that we could get ownership from all the parties once the product came about. But the one lesson we have, and I think I must share this lesson with you, that in whatever country we have gone, there is this tendency to be a bit too impatient by giving certain timelines. South Sudan was a very good example, without reading the conditions on the ground and allowing the conditions on the ground to dictate the timelines. Rather, we put certain dates on it. The second thing is that we've learned was that this notion of creating a one person, one vote and hurrying to that or hastening to come to that product doesn't necessarily work out. In South Africa, we had and we still have a system which accommodates a very large traditional community, and this creates contradictions in the democratic process, even in the constitution. But the constitution itself and the fact that we have a constitutional court allows for the organic development of values, values that are dictated by society itself. Both Professor and Priyal speak about the present conditions in South Africa. I think what saved us then and what saves us now is the fact that together with our processes, we had independent institutions, and the Constitution itself brought about independent and strong institutions. The judiciary saved us in this country in the last 10 years. So while the discussions took place, the existing institutions, they may have served the apartheid government at the time, were used, compromised as they were, but they enabled us to negotiate within the rule of law. I think also both Dr. and Priyal will agree that it's because of our strong civil society. And this is an assumption many of us make when we go into other countries, that civil society is strong. And that's where the focus has to be made. Our strong civil society, the faith-based organizations, the press, it was militant at times, that enable us to get to where we are, because it is civil society that determined the perimeters and the narrative around what was moral conduct and what was immoral conduct. This enabled us to create a strong center, a very moderate center. Many commentators may say that that wasn't a good thing, but in any event, what it did help was it made or it enabled us to squeeze out the extreme groupings and come to a free and fair election, to the extent that it was free and fair, but I mean, it was declared so. So there were a number of factors, and there were a number of factors that we assume exist in other countries when we negotiate there. But the most important aspect is the political process must include society, and national dialogue are not negotiable. It has to be a bottom-up approach, together with incentives for the various groupings to participate in a process that will make them feel included and own the process itself. Last point I'd like to make is that we often hasten to come to the content of the agreement without spending time on the process and the credibility of the process that brings us to the agreement. And that process in South Africa took us, we had talks for 2 years, ensuring that there was a buy-in on the process that will bring us to the agreement. Let me end off on that note, and then we can discuss later, because there's a much more that we can discuss. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for those very important insights. And let's move straight to Cheryl. Cheryl, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tim. So I'm going to take a slightly different approach. I'm going to first go broad and look at the need for a shift in the theory and practice of peace building itself, and then come to South Africa and the way that it has engaged. And I do this because South Africa obviously does not operate in a vacuum. It's part of larger discourses and practices around peace building. And so we need to understand that first and then come to South Africa. So we saw in the 1990s this shift towards what we now understand as the peace building agenda, a shift that occurred because the conflict context then was changing. And so we saw the need for internal peacemaking, for example, the need for conflict prevention, for multidimensional peace support, and for peace building in the form that we know it, more or less strengthening state institutions such as the security sector, and the formation of truth and reconciliation commissions and peace commissions, etc. And for a while there, we saw a decline in our conflict globally. But from 2013, I would date it to 2011, we definitely saw an increase in conflicts globally. And here we see a rise in violent extremism in both ethnic, religious, and racial variants thereof, a rise in local level non-state actor conflicts spurred on by climate change, a return to widespread and lengthy protest politics, as we saw in the Sudan, a rise in these kind of hashtag movements that we see, and the recurrent repeat mediation processes, as in the case of DRC and South Sudan, the remilitarization of our societies, new external actors also coming onto the continent, and then obviously the health and energy sector threats that we now face. So we see that the actors are changing, the levels of conflicts are also changing, but the sources, they seem to largely remain the same, linked to things like governance and marginalization, etc. The tactics also seem to remain largely the same, whether committed by violent extremists or rebels. It is this horrific violence committed on non-combatants and on women as well. The rebels and governments were okay with engaging in peace deals that then gave them access to power. I don't think violent extremists are interested to become ministers and MPs and army general in established national governments. Neither are those fighting at local levels over access to water or grazing land. So the quest of violent extremists is often larger than the boundaries of the states we have confined our peace building thinking and practice to, and those of communal conflicts are much more local. In peacemaking, we've also seen over the last 20 years a clamor for other actors to want to engage, so for youth, women, and civil society. And over the last 20 years, despite the discourse, we have not really been able to include these particular actors. Also, the shift towards national level peace processes at the expense of local peace building processes, even if our discourse says we need to be having these processes at multiple levels. Our peace processes remain protracted. We are handing over to military-led transitional councils, which for me is appearing to be more like coups by peace-building names. We are labeling others as terrorists and refusing to have dialogues and mediation with them and them with us. So we are not sufficiently engaged with changing relations, and those are key to transforming conflicts. We are more concerned to putting in place structures and concerned about representation. So all of this, I think, requires that we rethink how we do peace building in future. Saying that we need to address the root causes and concentrate on conflict prevention, I think, is simply not enough. The emphasis should be on the lack of accountability, the lack of emphasis on power and on politics and how they need to shift. A mismatch between our discourses on human security and our practices that remains largely securitized responses. Let me turn to South Africa's sphere of peace and security.
Sorry, I think we might be losing you, Cheryl. I think we have lost you, Cheryl. Hey.
Assumed chair of the SADC organ. Is it already 8 minutes? Can't be.
No, your Wi-Fi connectivity was also breaking a little bit. Yep.
So for South Africa, as explained.
Go ahead. Perhaps you can turn off your camera.
Tim, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Your image is frozen, so maybe turn off your camera maybe for the time being. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I don't know what you
Okay, go ahead now. We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Turning to South Africa, I'm going to assume that you have listened of the prior. Yeah, so it's to say that, okay, South Africa has held these positions, and whether or not it actually has a seat at these particular tables, it continues to be an important actor in terms of peace building, not only continentally, but globally as well. It's been part and parcel of the crux of the discourse and part of the thought leaders for the restructuring of the African Union and for SADC, for example. We also heard how it was part of the peace building in countries such as Burundi, etc., and engaging from mediation, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, post-conflict to post-conflict peace building measures, and also how it facilitated that relationship between the AU and other RECs. South Africa's government, as we also know, has been exporting its mediation experience, this formation of a government of national unity, and using the negotiations to decide on some of the key questions that would constitute part of a new constitution. So its experience actually led to us going beyond simply the ceasefire agreements to having negotiations in which new social contracts for societies were being constituted. But this script, I think, has largely fallen away post-2009, both internally for South Africa and in the way negotiations are taking place. So we know that post-2009 is the Zuma administration. Many have lamented South Africa's influence, credibility, and capacity, and how that has diminished post-2009, and how its overall approach on the continent seemed to shift from that concentrated on peace building to that concentrated more on economic issues, though I don't think that is quite the full story here. You will read about South Africa's vote on Libya, South Africa's vote on human rights, the xenophobic attacks, but what all of those constitute the legitimacy and credibility that South Africa had post the Zuma administration. And so now in the Ramaphosa administration, the ministers of defense and international relations have been at pains to say that we are re-engaging in peace building, that we need to be part of mediation, of peacekeeping, of the protection of civilians, but that we need to preface political solutions. These are the key words when we listen to the speeches. It's about political solutions. It's about respect for sovereignty. It's about prioritizing diplomacy. It's about using our multilateral institutions. And it's about Africa's problems must be resolved by Africans. Those sentiments come through in the speeches of our respective ministers and president. And entering the African Union, it said it was going to prioritize South Sudan and Libya as the countries in which it would engage. If we look at the script, it's pretty much the old pre-2009 script. That kind of approach is still largely the approach that we see going forward. No real new thinking around how we do conflict transformation. I think that our litmus test is going to come with Mozambique. We are asked to intervene in Mozambique. It's a completely different situation with violent extremists, and that's why I emphasize the ways in which violent extremists are acting, and that we can't go with this kind of script into Mozambique. We're going to have to rethink that. And we don't seem to have the capacity or the appetite for dealing with violent extremism. In conclusion, then, we need South Africa to provide more thought leadership by applying a critical lens to the current peace and security approaches, by producing more innovative and context-relevant strategies. South Africa has to revisit its own capacities. We need a conflict management strategy. We do not have this. And we also need, obviously, to deal with our own internal affairs. Our own peace infrastructure is no longer there. And that's why we see the kinds of capacity challenges. So we need to build up our own peace infrastructure as well. And then just the last one, in terms of peacekeeping, if we keep cutting the defense budget in the way that we do, we will not be able to deliver on peacekeeping. So yeah, that's what I want to state at this particular time, and then we can go with questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheriff, for that presentation. Much appreciated in terms of your insights. Now we're going to have a brief discussion amongst the panelists and also bring in some of the questions from the chat function that are coming through. I think, Cheryl, you ended up on not necessarily bleak, maybe it's partly hopeful point that in fact there really hasn't been that much new thinking in terms of conflict transformation. And that one of the, in South Africa and also the region as well, and one of the things that we need to do as a country, society, as a continent, is in fact to provide thought leadership, right, on conflict transformation going forward, peace building, reconciliation, and that you've actually been, you go one step further and says that South Africa itself needs a conflict transformation strategy, a national one at least, or maybe you might also be referring to a continental one, and that the country itself, South Africa, does not have an infrastructure for peace. I think that's a very important point also in terms of the experiences of other countries in the region, but also around the world. I think those are very important talking points. How we can flesh that out would be absolutely crucial. So I do want to open these points to the rest of the panel to consider, but I also want to touch on one or two things that Priyal and Mohammed raised. Priyal spoke a lot about the South Africa's role, in the region, the African Renaissance Fund, for example, and being utilized for peace building developmental purposes. My question to Priyal, or comment, maybe you can engage with it as you like, is in your view, do you think South Africa is punching above its weight in terms of these interventions that it's undertaking? And should it be prioritizing, perhaps even softer approaches like peacemaking, diplomacy, where the cost is much less, and South Africa, to a certain extent, had quite a significant moral capital that's been dented slightly now with some of the incidents of, around xenophobia. Something to think about. And Mohammed's point was very crucial in terms of, the South African context and how institutions were so vital to saving the country from really becoming even more derailed in terms of, the conflict transformation agenda, or at least the rule of law in the country, which is vital for conflict transformation. And yeah, the point I take away here is the absolute utility and the importance of institutions, of strong institutions, in supporting conflict transformation processes. And and a quick question for Mohammed then would be, from your perspective, do you feel that the current government, the governing party that's been in power for 26 years, has a sense that it's still engaged in some kind of a conflict transformation, peace building project, or has it shifted, to business as usual? I think there was also a reference in the questions as to whether, how the South African transition was more political than people-centered. And then what sorts of structures would you put in place to ensure that, the people are actively engaged? And even though South Africa has a strong basis for participation, consultation, and engagement, perhaps we haven't seen this coming through as much. Though there's a strong civil society presence in South Africa, and also South African civil societies working across the rest of the continent, the work you're doing at ITI, I think it's important to emphasize that the important role that civil society actors play in the context of conflict transformation. And then just to pick up on one or two questions in the chat function, which are open to any of the panelists to engage with. What is post-apartheid SA? That's a general question coming to all of us. And then the implication there is that perhaps the structural legacies of apartheid are still largely intact, and linked to that, maybe even problematizing it further, is that the mental constructs of apartheid are still very much intact. And then is that a case for much more psychosocial peace building? Part of South Africa's conflict transformation strategy is a focus on the mind, the mindset shift, the mental attitudes, addressing the deep trauma, and therefore psychosocial peace building. And then post-COVID, what lies ahead? Is COVID a wake-up call for not only South Africa, but the African continent to, in fact, forge much more ahead with solidarity, support, and so on? These are general points. I would like to just invite the panelists to engage with them as they see fit, and also bring in additional issues that you may have thought of or you didn't manage to speak to as we continue the conversation. So I'll start with Priyal, move to Mohammed, and then end with Sharon. Priyal, you have the floor.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I think these are really interesting questions. I think your question on, is South Africa punching above its weights currently? It depends. It depends on how we look at it. So, look, from 2019, South Africa served on the UN Security Council. It played a visible and active role. It chaired the African Union. It did play a visible and active role, and it did provide leadership on continental COVID responses. It's debatable how effective some of those responses have been, but I think from a diplomatic perspective, South Africa did provide that level, that margin of leadership on those issues. And currently, South Africa is a member of the UN Peacebuilding Commission. So South Africa is still very willing to take up key multilateral appointments to advance its foreign policy when it comes to peace building, conflict transformation, and so on. It's also very willing to take up these appointments to advance a collective African multilateralism on these issues, to advance common African positions on these issues. Having said that, I still don't think South Africa is doing enough. It's when we look at South Africa's previous engagements on peace building, on stabilization, on PCRD, on peacekeeping, on peace support operations. Look at the early 2000s, the late 1990s. South Africa wasn't doing very well economically at that time. Politically, South Africa has always been up and down in terms of, its political and economic health, if you want to call it that. And I think where we are today in 2021, to make the argument that our foreign policy is constrained by the various problems we face domestically. In some ways, it's a valid argument, but in many ways, if we had to contrast it to where South Africa has been previously in its post-apartheid history, that argument doesn't hold much water. So I think what has happened over the last couple of years is policymakers, government officials really just took their eye off the ball. Our foreign policy became diluted. There was no clear leadership provided, strategic leadership, moral leadership on the various issues. And what ended up is South Africa just paying lip service. We just pay lip service to global policy processes, debates, when it comes to peace building, conflict transformation, and we don't manifest that through tangible bilateral on-the-ground interventions. The government has never once made any voluntary contributions to the UN Peacebuilding Fund, for example. The African Renaissance Fund has probably paid out less than 10% of what it should be paying out when it comes to conflict, specifically conflict resolution initiatives, since at least 2017 or so. And so where we are is we're in a very constrained position. And what we need is we need to marry bilateral conflict transformation initiatives, on the ground projects, with what we say and do within global multilateral institutions. Prof, if there's time, I think there's just one other comment that was made on the PCR or the peace building debate at the level of the AU. I just want to quickly mention that PCRD, post-conflict reconstruction and development, does remain one of the weakest links when it comes to what the AU is able to do. It comes down to, number one, financing. Most of the funds that the African Union receives is generally channeled towards peace support operations. And when PCRD and peace building come up, those again are looked at within these mission settings, as opposed to standalone, dedicated interventions in support of peace building and stabilization specifically. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. The other big challenge is capacity. In some, the AU's Peace and Security Department have a handful of people, 10 people, 10 to 15 people sometimes, in charge of these kinds of portfolios. So we need to manage our expectations of what we expect the AU to do and how it interfaces with host governments, with conflict, with fragile and conflict-affected states. And lastly, there is a divergence. Conceptually, there is a divergence between what the UN and what member states of the UN think of as peace building and what the AU thinks of as peace building. The AU thinks of peace building very specifically under its PCRD policy framework, which looks at peace building from a very post-conflict perspective. You'd often find that conflict prevention, PCRD, and stabilization are concepts that are very divorced from each other within the African Union, and they often worked on in silos institutionally at the AU. Whereas at the UN takes a much more holistic kind of approach where it links conflict prevention to peace building, to stabilization, it looks at this as a process rather than a specific activity. So it's an ongoing process. And I think South Africa has played a good role in trying to merge those two conceptual differences between the organizations in recent years. But there's still a lot more work to be done. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Priya. Mohammed, can we move to you?
Yeah, Professor, it's interesting that you mentioned that there's a fight for the soul of the ruling party in South Africa. Often when we enter other countries, one of the objectives is to find an enduring agreement and a settlement. And someone did allude to the fact that why do these fall apart? But I'd like to reflect on South Africa because there are some questions that are South African specific. I don't know what I use as the litmus test, but what I can tell you is that in our democracy, it's 25 years, in fact, this week that we've had the constitution. We've had 2 presidents removed from office. And what was surprising is people went on with their work as if nothing happened. There wasn't any unrest in the streets. The second is, including Nelson Mandela, there were 3 presidents taken to court. Apart from that, a number of senior members of the ruling party who have struggle credentials, including our former commissioner of police, that were taken to court. And somehow this did not this did not end up in unrest in the streets. And if that is being used as a litmus test, then perhaps our focus on creating strong institutions has helped. The Zondo Commission itself, I don't know of any other case anywhere in the world, but perhaps I'm being a bit presumptuous here, where a ruling party has bared its own soul in public. Now, whatever the motives may be, and yet life is going on. And at the moment, the integrity as well as the credibility of the Zondo Commission, in other words, the judiciary is being attacked. But over and over and over again, we've been saved by this judiciary. There were efforts in the last 10 years, as in some major countries, as we've seen, let me mention in the US itself, an attack by a standing president to weaken the institutions. And that has happened in South Africa as well. So I cannot overemphasize in whatever settlements we come with, the existence of independent institutions that are accessible to the people in the street. It's a weakness in South Africa. In PL, I think you and I need a discussion on this at some stage, is many of the service delivery protests emanate from 2 things. One is, as a country, or maybe 3 things. As a country, if I look back, we did not address the structures of the economy in the manner that we should have, and we're paying for it. The second is, while we can laud the independent institutions, whether we are accessible to the ordinary and the poor, whether these institutions are accessible, in many instances, it's just through the efforts of NGOs that people come to the court, particularly the poor. And they do what they always knew what to do, is to protest in the streets. And the third, Professor, I think we need to reflect on this, is whether we did enough to create the kind of state machinery to be able to deliver on the promises we made. We'd like to think about strong, accountable institutions, but I don't think we've done enough. And those are some of the lessons. I think as a country and as the architecture of our country, we are over-engineered. We're wasting a lot of money. And at the end of the day, we're depriving the very people we claim to be representing. And that's largely because of the quality of our administration as well. So these are lessons, obviously. When we go, political solutions are nice, they sound good on paper, but we have to look 10 years down the line whether those agreements are implementable and there is an appropriate machinery to do it. So those are some of the lessons. So while there are some good stories, and I'd really like to believe, I hope I'm not sounding too patriotic, but I'd like to believe that for an emerging democracy that's 25 years old, we haven't had quite the Arab Spring, despite the seismic activity that took place in this country, the removal of presidents. And to come back to your point, Professor Tim, the fight for the soul of the ANC, to put it very simplistic, is between now, I think, people who we could call constitutionalists, who want that rule of law, against those which I very crudely put, who are predators, who would not like to have that rule of law. So let me leave it at that, and then we can debate it further.
Thank you, Mohammed, for that. And in fact, there is a question in the chat function that does precisely touch upon that issue as to, is there this cohort, a group, known as the Radical Economic Transformation Group, that is in effect undermining the rule of law? And the link to that question is the question of ethical leadership going forward. How important is that, and how can it be revitalized in order to put South Africa back on track to pursue its conflict transformation agenda? And let me just add to, before Cheryl jumps in, an additional question that emerged from your presentation, Cheryl, in which you referenced the declining defense budget, or at least the declining allocation of resources to defense. And then the question linked to that is, how can South Africa, in fact, continue to play its role in peace building and peacekeeping? And are there any alternatives if the government budget is declining? And the one thing that springs to my mind is the role of regional actors. And there is also a query about the role of the African Union and SADC in peace building and conflict transformation. And how do we see maybe South Africa influencing those institutions going forward? Cheryl, you have the floor.
Thank you, Tim. I just want to first come in on this point around strengthening institutions. I think it is important, obviously, it's a no-brainer that we have to strengthen our institutions. But institutions can be so easily hollowed out also by respective leaders that are there. So there's a way in which we also have to develop those accountability mechanisms so that, in the ways that we have seen it transpire in our country and in other African countries, so that that does not occur so easily. Secondly, we can't only concentrate on strengthening institutions, we really have to concentrate on changing relations and ways in which we interact with each other. And then thirdly, on creating more channels in which grievances can be expressed in our societies, because partly why people resort to violence so quickly, the other avenues for participation don't seem to be there. And then I want to agree with a comment about a particularly traumatized society. I do think that we are in a post-apartheid society. We're certainly not in the apartheid society we grew up in. We do have our challenges related to governance, to the economy, and the levers of the economy still being largely in white hands, to corruption, etc. But we have seen major changes, especially politically, in terms of our education, socially, etc. We can't just wish those away. But the point here is that we actually have not dealt with the collective trauma of our society. And that spurs on much of the violence, especially along the gender-based violence that we see. So we have to go back and do that kind of reconciliation that is necessary. Then to come to the questions that you specifically posed to me or asked me to reflect deeper about. The first is around thought leadership. So I strongly believe that during the Mbeki era, the early 1990s, while Mandela was still there, because I'm talking about the Kampala dialogues and resolution that came out of that, and then those interactions that led almost to the formation of the African Union. That was a specific way in which South Africa, as part of a broader community, was leading on what we mean by peace and security, what kinds of structures we need, etc. And I really think that it is an opportune moment for us to engage in those kinds of conversations again. And that is what I mean by thought leadership in this particular context. Around a conflict transformation strategy, we don't have one in South Africa. And so we determine our conflict management approach via our practices. We also have very dated white papers, our foreign policies dated, our peace missions, peace support operations paper is 1998, I think. So there's really a space here for us to think through a conflict management strategy. This was going to come through with the formation of SADPA, but SADPA also died as a still death. It was stillborn. So the space is there for us to think through this conflict management strategy. It's actually written into the Women, Peace and Security National Action Plan that we need this strategy. So it has been adopted by government as well. We just need to get our heads together to do this. Then around infrastructure for peace. We don't have the kind of peace committees, specialists in peace that we used to have in the heyday of the 80s and 90s any longer. There are very few of us still left. And most of us are not looking internally, we are looking at conflicts externally as well. There is, however, lots of very locally based community organizations operating there, and it's how we create these linkages and build the other institutions, the peace centers, the research institutes, etc., that we need. That peace infrastructure, if we're really going to do well within South Africa and on the continent and internationally in terms of engaging in peace building, then we need to get our own house in order in terms of this. Then last, in terms of the defense budget, we're not likely to see an increase in the defense budget. Every year we see a cut in the defense budget. And on the whole, we argue that we shouldn't be spending too much of the taxpayers' money on defense, that more of the money should be going towards development. But the kinds of demands that have been placed on defense also leave it in a kind of a position where it can't perform in the ways that it is expected. So we certainly have to think through more innovatively how we work through the SADC standby force, through the African standby force, but what we do, and this is where a conflict management strategy would come from, in terms of peacekeeping, where do we want to intervene, in which ways, etc. So right now we are limited to the DRC. And going forward, where do we want to intervene in terms of peacekeeping? And how do we want to use our defense more innovatively to deal with some of our challenges here in South Africa as well? Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl, for those insights. So we have about 10 more minutes of this conversation. I do want to put maybe three or two additional themes on the table for discussion. One is the environment, which has come up in the chat function. The role of environmental change, environmental degradation, and how that impacts on peace and security and conflict transformation. Should, for example, our conflict management strategy, conflict transformation strategy you're talking about, Cheryl, have a key focus on how to address environmental conflicts they exist in South Africa. They're also happening in a number of other African countries going forward. So that's an interesting question for us, perhaps in terms of the thought leadership is something to put on the table as well. And then the next is something that we're quite familiar with and we've touched upon, is the socioeconomic interventions. We still struggle to seem to get this right, not only in South Africa but in a number of African countries. The direct question on the chat function is, how can we problematize an economic model that prioritizes private profit, over the general broad-based well-being of society, and therefore, essentially, by its design, it fails to deliver on economic justice. And then the direct question from Angela Mickley is there any strategy to engage the youth, as agents of conflict transformation? Another contributor agrees that the transformative power of education is crucial in terms of empowering youth to have the agency to transform their communities from the grassroots, but also, from the high level. Sometimes we need to get those ideas into the table. And in terms of South Africa doesn't have like a playbook on conflict transformation per se, let me put it bluntly in that way. But this underlying, Ubuntu ideology, which goes back to the founding of the country, Desmond Tutu, for example, in leading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, referenced both Ubuntu values and his Christianity in terms of guiding that process forward. Mandela, speaks of that in his book, The Long Walk to Freedom. So is this South Africa almost, is there an assumption that there is this underlying Ubuntu, ideology that underpins the society, and that's kind of our unspoken, unmentioned, and unwritten, trajectory? And I think there was I think it was a white paper that was published that actually used the phrase Ubuntu diplomacy in terms of South Africa's, engagement in the region. So I think we would like to just touch upon that briefly, because it's lying there almost latent, but perhaps not actualized, and maybe sometimes too sensationalized and even monetized, to put it bluntly. And maybe as we begin to engage with new ideas on conflict transformation, or at least revitalizing some ideas on conflict transformation, we should begin to also unpack that issue briefly. So I would just like you to keep your contributions as brief as you can, maybe 2-3 minutes max. And then we shall begin to bring this to a wrap by having Veronique also come in and share her thoughts on the conversation. Thank you. Let me start again with Priyal, Mohammed, and Cheryl. Priyal?
Thanks, Prof. I think Mohammed and Professor Cheryl will probably have better answers than me on these issues. Look, the Ubuntu diplomacy question, it's an interesting one. I think my personal views on it is more just as a South African as opposed to a researcher. But, from what I've observed, we definitely went through a wave, a particular period in which this kind of philosophy really did underpin our foreign policy and the way government functioned, and the relationship between civil society and the government and the private sector. And I think the last decade really put a massive strain on that kind of general philosophy of how we'd like to think of ourselves as South Africans, of our relationship with the states, our relationship with our public officials. I think, look, like Mohammed said, there is cause for optimism. The fact that our institutions, our media, our civil society helps us to weather the storm of the last decade or and a couple of years is definitely a cause for optimism, but it's something we need to continually invest in. And I think that just brings me to my second point when it comes to private sector investment in peace building and conflict transformation. We absolutely need to go over and above and beyond what this social corporate responsibility model that we have is. Domestically, and in South Africa's engagements and interventions abroad, there's two things that need to happen. A couple of years ago, the World Bank did this report called Pathways to Peace. And what's interesting about that report is it really it shone attention onto the fact that there's two things we need. We need a business case in which we can effectively sell peace building, conflict prevention, conflict transformation to the private sector. And the second thing is we need to incentivize private actors to buy into the rationale and the logic of why they need to do this. I think South Africa is an absolutely critical state in which we can test out new ideas. Just given the fact that our economy can't function if private sectors don't come on board and see the value or see their value in creating the conditions necessary for a peaceful society, just given the history of the country. And I think that's something, if we can refine, if we can define and we can refine a model for how business and private sectors invest in peace building domestically, then something we can definitely export across the region and across the continent. And look, it's not my area of expertise, but I think there are definite cases in which this has already happened. And it's something we need to definitely explore. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Mohammed?
Yes, I'm going to respond somewhat to a question from, I think it's Ruby Quanston Davis, that's on the chat line, but also touch on one or two things that Priyal has said. You know, there's been, firstly, we have not done enough to address the trauma. And the trauma is exacerbated by one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. So we have a very divided society. And to touch on what Priyal is saying, so let's look at the trauma. I don't know, somehow we've had an attitude that the work has been done. And, you know, we must continue with governance and, you know, we've got a settlement. So I agree with you, and even the faith-based organizations that were so active at the time somehow are not focusing on this. So you are absolutely correct that we have to attend to this and focus on this. The second point is something that Priyal discusses. And Priyal and Professor, you'd be able to, or you'll remember that there was a narrative in the last 5-6 years that Mandela sold out the cause. And I think there was a counter narrative that was then brought. Did we sell Mandela's dream? Did we sell out on Mandela's dream, or did Mandela sell us out? And that touches on the question is, did the private sector itself understand the implications and what this country required in its contribution to peace building? We can talk about the imbalance in the economic and the restructuring of the economy. But by and large, the private sector and the vested interests that existed before apartheid got away with quite a bit. And the fact that we had to legislate to create employment equity showed that there wasn't necessarily a sense of voluntarism and a commitment to rebuilding the country, and particularly the economy. So the Gini coefficient translates to a lot of what we see in our violent crime and our crime statistics as well. We are beginning to see green shoots of a commitment coming out from the private sector, and also this largely stems from a huge trust deficit that existed in the last 10 years for the manner in which we behaved as a country, and particularly the lack of leadership and the nature of the leadership. We're hoping that that does come to fruition. But again, what Priyal is saying, that the commitment from the private sector is going to be crucial for this, coupled with the fact that what Professor Cheryl has said, I think you mentioned it, that political leadership is necessary, that it comes out. We need the kind of political leadership that carries this through, the ethical leadership that we're talking about. What I've noticed, and I am part of the ruling party, I must confess, these days I have to confess to be a member of the ruling party. That's where we are. But anyway, the point is that yes, political leadership is extremely important, but we've also gone into this mode of just being complacent and going into autopilot. We need to start rethinking what goes on in the next 10 years. Otherwise, we'll be addressing the same issues over and over and over again. Anyway, yeah, let me move on.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you also for the full disclosure and confessing your, shall I say, allegiance. It's good to see a man who puts all his cards on the table. Cheryl, can you give us your closing comments or remarks in a concise manner? Thank you.
So very concisely, yes, certainly any conflict management strategy must deal with environmental change, must deal with issues such as those emanating from the health sector, from the energy sector, must deal with issues of violent extremism. So it can't simply be one peace building approach. We need to have various approaches to deal with the different kinds of conflicts as well. Secondly, that if we want ethical leadership, we need to appoint or elect ethical leaders. But more importantly, we need to put in place the structures that hold those leaders to account, because they go in good, they don't go in bad. It's something about the nature of our state that also makes them corrupt when they are there. Thirdly, around youth and how to bring youth in. So I think that the whole discourse around youth and its engagement in peace and security is falling into very similar traps to that of women, peace and security. They basically, I think, just took the UN Security Council resolution 5 and put the word youth instead of women. In 20 years, we have not been able to move very far on this particular agenda. Youth will find themselves in the same position in 20 years. They actually need to lead on an agenda of not being included into the one that exists, but into creating an agenda that is going to take us forward for the next 50 years. And then on this playbook of Ubuntu, it is an ideal. We always have to have an ideal and a vision that we aspire to. The practice thereof will differ always. And so for a long time, the politics of the value rather than Ubuntu has been the one at play in South Africa. We need to change that. The questions around going into Mozambique is what is it in our national interest? So that alone poses the question for us, what is our national interest at this particular time? So lots of conversations to be had in South Africa, regionally and continentally, Tim and my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you for that insight. And then I want to now hand over to Veronique to just give us a reflection, her reflection of the discussion and maybe one or two takeaways. Veronique, you have the floor.
Great. Many thanks, Tim. Thank you to our panelists for this very rich conversation. And of course, I cannot do justice to this vibrant discussion that has been going on both among panelists as well as in the chat. We've had very interesting and complementary sets of perspectives on the one hand, the internal conflict transformation process, which South Africa has undergone ever since the end of the apartheid with its ups and downs. And on the other hand, the regional approach that South Africa has taken to peace building and conflict transformation on the African continent, with the sense that for close to 2 decades, until 2009, the South Africa transition and its new leaders had gained a lot of moral authority and progressive approaches that have been put to the service of supporting peace building and conflict transformation in places like Burundi, the DRC and South Sudan. And in the last decade, the idea that that support to peace building by the South African state has become constrained by a lot of the challenges that have been going on internally. On the positive side, I've heard a lot of very interesting thoughts about this idea of Ubuntu that was mentioned at the end, whatever our differences, we have managed to create one South Africa. There's been a lot of tradition of a strong civil society activism, the importance of independent institutions, and also the inclusive transition that has enabled a bottom-up approach that has built incentives for various groups to be part of creating that new South Africa. But on the negative sides, we've heard a lot about challenges that will need to be reckoned with and addressed in terms of making South Africa support stronger abroad in supporting peace building in Africa and beyond, the importance of focusing more on peace building than on peacekeeping, the importance of financial investment, long-term focus, needing new recipes for new challenges such as violent extremism, the importance of focusing more on the development of economic justice and adequate economic structures, the importance of focusing on changing relationships, addressing psychosocial legacy of war and trauma. So I'm leaving with these thoughts that a new thought leadership is needed that would emphasize a new playbook, both for an internal approach to finishing this transformation of the long-term conflict in South Africa, but also a playbook for how to approach peace building on the continent, how to incentivize the private sector to invest in this sector, how to create its own peace infrastructure, and how to create channels where grievances can be expressed in society. So I'm very, very grateful for all of those great thoughts that have been expressed. And I would like to close this session by thanking the panelists, inviting all of you to come to our next session that you will receive an invitation for, and wish you a very good rest of the day. Bye-bye.